The video has started, I think, and let's see which part. Oh, good thing I had a bookmark, right? Okay, so bookmark does help. Good thing I have bought this. Why? Okay, so this will be the part 3, and okay, I already showed the bookmark right now. I am on page number 58, so I will read from page 58. Okay, so page 58, that's it. Okay, so I will just go little bit, one or two paragraph before, I think. Oh, where did I bookmark? Let's have 58. Okay, 58. That's it. Where is pencil? Okay, here's the pencil. Pencil here. Okay, so Google search will open. Okay. Again and again, what happened on our arrival in that camp? After a journey lasting 2 days and 3 nights, there had not been enough room for everybody to crouch on the floor of the carriage at the same time. The majority of us had to stand all the way, while a few took turns at squatting on the scanty straw. Small or insufficient in quantity or amount. Small or insufficient in quantity. Small or insufficient in quantity. Had to stand all the way, while a few took turns at squatting at the scanty straw, which was soaked with human. When we arrived, the first important news that we heard from other prisoner was that. Okay, I am way too. The merger pleasures of camp life provided a kind of negative happiness, freedom from suffering, as Sofener put it, and even that in relative way only. Real positive pleasures, even small ones, were very few. I remember drawing up a kind of balance sheet of pleasures one day, finding that in many past weeks I had experienced only 2 pleasurable moments. When I returning from work, I was admitted to cook house after a long wait and was assigned in the lining filling up the prisoner cook F. He stood behind one of the huge pans and ladled soup into the bowl which were held out to him by the prisoners who hurriedly filed past. He was the only cook who did not look at the man whose bowls he was filling, the only cook who dealt out the soup equally regardless of recipient, and who did not make favorites of his personal friends or countrymen, picking out the potatoes for them while the others got watery soup skimmed from the top. But it is not for me to pass judgment on those prisoners who put their own people above everyone else, who can throw a stone at a man who favors his friends under circumstances when, sooner or later, it is a question of life or death. No man should judge unless he asks himself in absolute honesty whether in a similar situation he might not have done the same. Long after I had resumed normal life again, that means a long time after my release from camp, somebody showed me an illustrated weekly with photographs of prisoners lying crowded in their bunks. Starting Dully, the visitor, isn't this terrible? The dreadful staring faces, everything about it. I asked for. I genuinely did not understand, for at the moment I saw it all. Aging. Engine at 5 a.m. It was still pitch dark outside. I was lying on the hard boards in an earthen hut where about 70 of us were taken care of. We were sick and did not have to leave camp for work. We did not have to go on parade. We could lie all day in our little corner in the hut and doze and wait for the daily distribution of bread, which of course was reduced for the sick, for the daily helping of soup, watered down and also decreased in quantity. But how content we were, happy in spite of everything, while we cowered against each other to avoid any unnecessary loss of warmth, and were too lazy and disinterested to move a finger unnecessarily. We heard shrill whistles and shouts from the square, where the night shift had just returned and was assembling for roll call. The door was flung open, and the snowstorm blew into our hut. An exhausted comrade, covered with snow, stumbled inside to sit down for a few minutes, but the senior warden turned him out again. It was strictly forbidden to admit a stranger to a hut while a checkup on the man was in progress. How sorry I was for that fellow, and did how glad not to be in his skin at the moment, but instead to be sick and able to doze in the sick quarters. What a lifesaver it was to have 2 days there, and perhaps even 2 extra days after those. All this came to my mind when I saw the photographs in the magazine. When I explained, my listeners understood why I did not find the photograph so terrible. The people shown on it might not have been so unhappy after all. On my fourth day in the sick quarters, I had just been detailed to the night shift when the chief doctor asked me to volunteer for medical duties in another camp containing typhus patients against the urgent advice of my friend. And despite the fact that almost none of my colleagues offered their services, I decided to volunteer. I knew that in a working party I would die in a short time, but if I had to die, there might at least be some sense in my death. I thought that it would be doubtless be more to the purpose to try and help my comrades as a doctor than to vegetate or finally lose my life as the unproductive laborer that I was then. Okay, for me this was simple mathematics, not sacrifice. But secretly, the warrant officer from the sanitation squad had ordered that the two doctors who had volunteered for the typhus camp should be taken care of till they left. We looked so weak that he feared that he might have two additional corpses on his hand rather than two doctors. I mentioned earlier how everything that was not connected with the immediate task of keeping oneself and one's closest friends alive lost its value. Everything was sacrificed to this end. A man's character became involved to the point that he was caught in a mental turmoil which threatened all the values he held and threw them into doubt under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which had robbed man of his will and had made him an object to be exterminated, having planned, however, to make full use of him first, the last ounce of his physical resources. Under this influence, the personal ego finally suffered a loss of values. The man in the concentration camp did not struggle against this. In a last effort to save his self-respect, he lost the feeling of being an individual, a being with a mind, with inner freedom and personal value. He thought of himself then as only a part of an enormous mass of people. His existence descended to the level of animal life. The men were herded sometimes to one place to then the another, sometimes driven together, then apart alike, a flock of sheep without a thought or a will of their own. A small but dangerous pack watched them from all sides, well versed in methods of torture and sadism. They drove the herd insensately backwards and forwards with shouts, kicks, and blows, and we, the sheep, thought of two things only: how to evade the bad dogs and how to get a little food. Just like sheep, the crowd timidly into the center of an herd. Each of us tried to get into the middle of our formations, that gave one a better chance of avoiding the blows of the guards who were marching on either side and to the front and rear of our column. The central position had the added advantage of affording protection against the bitter wind. It was therefore in an attempt to save one's own skin that one literally tried to submerge into the crowd. That was done automatically in the formation, but other times it was very conscious effort on our part. In conformity with one of the camp's most imperative laws of self-preservation, do not be conspicuous. We tried all the times to avoid attraction the attention of the SS. There were times, of course, when it was possible and even necessary to keep away from the crowd. It is well known that an enforced community life, in which attention is paid to everything one does at all times, may result in an irresistible urge to get away, at least for a short while. The prisoner craved to be alone with himself and his thoughts. He yearned for privacy and for solitude. After my transportation to so called rest camp, I had the rare fortune to find solitude for about 5 times at a time behind the earthen hut where I worked and in which were crowded about 50 delirious patients. There was a quiet spot in an corner of the double fence of barbed wire surrounding the camp. A tent had been improvised there with a few poles and branches of trees in order to shelter an half-dozen corpses. The daily death rate in the camp. There was also a shaft leading to the water pipes. I squatted on the wooden lid of this shaft. Whenever my services were not needed, I just sat and looked out of the green flowering slopes and the distant blue hills of the Bavarian landscape, framed by the meshes of barbed wire. I dreamed longingly, and my thoughts wandered north and northeast in the direction of my home, but I could only see clouds. The corpses near me crawling with lice did not bother me. Only the steps of passing guards could rouse me from my dreams, or perhaps it would be a call to the sick bay or to collect a newly arrived supply of medicine for my hut consisting of perhaps 5 or 10 tables of aspirin to last for several days for 50 patients. I collected them and then did my rounds, feeling the patients' pulses and giving half tables to the serious cases. But the desperately ill received no medicine. I would not have helped, and besides, it would have deprived those for whom there is still some hope for light cases. I had nothing except perhaps a word of encouragement. In this way, I dragged myself from patient to patient. Thought I myself was weak and exhausted from a serious attack of typhus. Then I went back to my lonely place in the wood cover of the water shaft. This shaft accidentally once saved the lives of 3 fellow prisoners. Shortly before liberation, mass transports were organized to go Dachau, and these 3 prisoners wisely tried to avoid the trip. They climbed down the shaft and hid there from the guards. I calmly sat on the lid, looking innocent and playing a childish game of throwing pebbles at the barbed wire. On spotting me, the guard hesitated for a moment, but then passed on. Soon I could tell the 3 men below the worst danger was over. It is very difficult for an outsider to grasp how very little value was placed on human life in camp. The camp inmates were hardened, but possibly became more conscious of this complete disregard of human existence. When a convoy of sick men was arranged, the emaciated bodies of the sick were thrown onto wheeled carts, which were drawn by prisoners for many miles, often through snowstorms, to the next camp. If one of the sick men had died before the cart left, he was thrown on anyway. The list had to be correct. The list was the only thing that mattered. A man counted only because he had a prison number. One literally became a number, dead or alive. That was unimportant. The life of a number was completely irrelevant. What stood behind the number and that life mattered even less. The faith, the history, the name of the man in the transport of sick patients that I, in my capacity as a doctor, had to accompany from one camp in Bavaria to another. There was a young prisoner whose brother was not on the list and therefore would have to be left behind. The young man begged so long that the camp warden decided to work an exchange, and the brother took the place of man who in the moment preferred to stay behind, but the list had to be correct. That was easy. The brother just exchanged numbers with the other prisoners. As I have mentioned before, we had no documents. Everyone was lucky to own his body, which after all was still breathing. All else about us, that is the rage hanging from our gaunt skeletons, was only if interest if we were assigned to a transport of sick patients. The departing Muslims were examined with unabashed curiosity to see whether their coats or shoes were not better than one's own. After all, their fates were not better than one's own. After all, their fate was sealed. But those who stayed behind in camp, who were still capable of some work, had to make use of every means to improve their chances of survival. They were not sentimental. The prisoners saw themselves completely dependent on the moods of the guards. Playthings, playthings of, and this made them even less human than the circumstances warranted. In Auschwitz, I had laid down a role for myself, which proved to be a good one, and which most of my comrades later followed. I generally answered all kinds of questions truthfully, but I was silent about anything that was not expressly asked for. If I were asked my age, I gave it. If asked about my profession, I said doctor, but did not elaborate. The first morning in Auschwitz, an SS officer came to the parade ground. We had to fall into separate groups of prisoners over 40 years, under 40 years, metal workers, mechanics, and so forth. Then we were examined for ruptures, and some prisoners had to form a new group. The group that I was in was driven to another hut where we lined up against. After being sorted out once more and having answered questions as to my age and profession, I was sent to another small group. Once more, we were driven to another hut and grouped differently. This continued for some time, and I became quite unhappy, finding myself among strangers who spoke intelligible foreign languages. Then came the last selection, and I found myself back in the group that had been with me in the first hut. They had barely noticed that I had been sent from hut to hut in the meantime, but I was aware that in those few minutes fate had passed me in many different forms. When the transport of sick patients for the rest camp was organized, my name, that is my number, was put on the list since a few doctors were needed, but no one was convinced that the destination was really a rest camp. A few weeks previously, the same transport had been prepared then too. Everyone had thought that it was destined for the gas ovens. When it was announced that anyone who volunteered for the dreaded night shift would be taken off the transport list, 82 prisoners volunteered immediately. A quarter of an hour later, the transport was cancelled, but the 82 stayed in the list for the night shift. For the majority of them, that means death within the next fortnight. Now, the transport for the rest camp was arranged for the second time. Again, no one knew whether this was a rush to obtain the last bit of work from the sick, if only for 14 days, or whether it would go to the gas ovens or to a genuine rest camp. The chief doctor, who had taken a liking to me, told me furtively one evening at 9:15, I have made it known in the orderly room that you can still have your name crossed off the list. You may do so up till 10 o'clock. I told him that this was not my way, that I had learned to let fate take its course. I might as well stay with my friends, I said. There was a look of pity in his eyes, as if he knew. He shook my hand silently, as though it were a farewell, not for life, but from life. Slowly I walked back to my hut. There I found a good friend waiting for me. You really want to go with them? He asked sadly. Yes, I'm going. Tears came to his eyes, and I tried to comfort him. Then there was something else to do, to make my will. Listen, Otto, if I don't get back home to my wife, and if you should see her again, then tell her that I talked of her daily hours. You remember. Secondly, I have loved her more than anyone. Thirdly, the short time I have been married to her outweighs everything, even all we have gone through there. Otto, where are you now? Are you alive? What has happened to you since our last hour together? Did you find your wife again? And do you remember how I made you learn my will by heart, word for word, in spite of your childlike tears? Next morning I departed with the transport. This time it was not a ruse. We were not heading for the guest chambers, and we actually did go to a rest camp. Those who had betrayed me remained in a camp where famine was to rage even more fiercely than in our new camp. They tried to save themselves, but they only sealed their own fates. Months later, after liberation, I met a friend from the old camp. He related Tom how he, as camp policeman, had searched for a piece of human flesh that was missing from a pile of corpses. He confiscated it from a pot in which he found it cooking. Cannibalism had broken out. I had left just in time. Does this not bring in the to mind the story of death in Tehran? A rich and mighty Persian once walked in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried that he had just encountered death, who had threatened him. He begged his master to give his fastest horse so that he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met death and questioned him. Why, on returning to his house, the master himself met death and questioning him, "Why did you terrify and threaten my servant?" "I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here when I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran," said Death. The camp inmate was frightened of making decisions and of taking any sort of initiative whatsoever. This was the result of a strong feeling that fate was one's master and that one must not try to influence it in any way, but instead let it take its own course. In addition, there was a great apathy which contributed in no small part to the feelings of the prisoner. At times, lightning decisions had to be made, decisions which spelled life or death. The prisoner would have preferred to let fate make the choice for him. This escape from commitment was most apparent when a prisoner had to make the decision for or against an escape attempt. In those minutes in which he had to make up his mind, and it was always a question of minutes, he suffered the tortures of hell. Should he make the attempt to flee? Should he take the risk? I too experienced this torment. As the battlefront drew nearer, I had the opportunity to escape. A colleague of mine who had to visit huts outside the camp in the course of his medical duties wanted to escape and take me with him under the pretense of holding a consultation about a patient whose illness required a specialist's advice. He smuggled me out. Outside the camp, a member of a foreign resistance movement was to supply us with uniforms and documents. At the last moment, there was some technical difficulties, and we had to return to the camp once more. We used this opportunity to provide ourselves with provisions, a few rotten potatoes, and to look for a rucksack. We broke into an empty hut of the women's camp, which was vacant as the woman had been sent to another camp. The hut was in great disorder. It was obvious that many women had acquired supplies and fled. There were rags, straw, rotting food, and broken crockery. Some bowls were still in good condition and would have been very valuable to us, but we decided not to take them. We knew that lately, as conditions had become desperate, they had been used not only for food but also a wash basin and chamber pots. There was strictly enforced rule against having any kind of utensil in the hut. However, some people were forced to break this rule, especially the typhus patients who were much too weak to go outside even with the help. while I acted as a screen. My friend broke into the hut and returned shortly with a rucksack which he hid under the coat. He had seen another one inside which I was to take. So we changed places and I went in. As I reached in the rubbish, finding the rucksack and even a toothbrush, I suddenly saw among all the things that had been left behind the body of a woman. I ran back to my hut to collect all my possessions, my football, a pair of torn mittens inherited it from a dead typhus patient, and a few scraps of paper covered with shortened notes, on which, as I mentioned before, I had started to reconstruct the manuscript which I had lost as Auschwitz. I made a quick last round of my patients who were lying huddled on the rotten planks of wood on either sides of the huts. I came to my only countryman who was almost dying and whose life it had been my ambition to save in spite of his condition. I had to keep my intention to escape to myself, but my comrade seemed to guess that something was wrong. Perhaps I showed a little nervousness. In a tired voice, he asked me, "You two are getting out." I denied it, but I found it difficult to avoid his sad look. After my round, I returned to him. Again, a hopeless look greeted me, and somehow I felt it to be an accusation, that unpleasant feeling that had gripped me as soon as I had told my friend I would escape with him become more intense. Suddenly, I decided to take fate into my own hands. For once, I ran out to the hut and told my friend that I could not go with him. As soon as I had told him with finality that I had made up my mind to stay with my patients, the unhappy feeling left me. I did not know what the following days would bring, but I had gained an inward peace that I had never experienced before. I returned to the hut, sat down on the porch on my countryman's feet, and tried to comfort him. Then I chatted with the others, trying to quiet them in their delirium. Our last day in camp arrived. As the battlefront came nearer, mass transport had taken nearly all the prisoners to other camps. The camp authorities, the capos, and the cooks had fled. On this day, an order was given that the camp must be evacuated completely by sunset. Even the few remaining prisoners, the sick, a few doctors, and some nurses would have to leave. At night, the camp was to be set on fire. In the afternoon, the trucks which were to collect the sick had not yet appeared. Instead, the camp gates were suddenly closed and the barbed wire closely watched so that no one could attempt an escape. The remaining prisoners seemed to be destined to burn with the camp. For the second time, my friend and I decided to escape. We had been given an order to bury 3 men outside the barbed wire fence. We were the only two in camp who had strength enough to do the job. Nearly all the others lay in few huts which were still in use, prostrate with fever and delirium. We now made our plans. Along with the first body, we would smuggle out my friend's rucksack, hiding it in the old laundry tub which served as a coffin. When we took out the second body, we would also carry out rucksack, and in the third trip we intended to make our escape. The first 2 trips went according to the plan. After we returned, I read my felt tried to find a piece of bread so that it would have something to eat. During the next few days in the woods, I waited. Minutes passed. I became more and more impatient as he did not return. After 3 years of imprisonment, I was picturing freedom joyously, imagining how wonderful it would be to run toward the battlefront. But we did not get that far. There, the very moment when my friend came back, the camp gate was thrown open. A splendid aluminium colored car on which were painted large red crosses slowly rolled onto the parade ground. A delegate from the International Red Cross in Geneva had arrived, and the camp and its inmates were under its protection. The delegate billeted himself in a farmhouse in the vicinity in order to be near the camp at all times in case of emergency. Worried who worried about escape now? Boxes with medicines were unloaded from the car. Cigarettes were distributed now. Where photograph and joy resigned supreme, now there was no need for us to risk running toward the fighting line. In our excitement, we had forgotten the third body, so we carried it outside and dropped it in the narrow grave we had dug for the three corpses. The guard who accomplished us, a relatively inoffensive man, suddenly became quite gentle. He saw that the tables might be turned and tried to win our goodwill. He joined to the short prayers that we offered for the dead men before throwing soil over them. After the tension and excitement of the past days and hours, those last days in our race with death, the words of our prayer asking for peace were as fervent as any ever uttered by the human voice. And so the last day in camp passed in anticipation of freedom. But we rejoiced too early. The Red Cross's delegate had assured us that an agreement had been signed and that the camp must not be evacuated. But that night the SS arrived with trucks and brought an order to clean the camp. The last remaining prisoners were to be taken to a central camp from which they would be sent to Switzerland within 48 hours to be exchanged for some prisoners of war. We scarcely recognized the SS. They were so friendly, trying to persuade us to get in the trucks without fear, telling us that we should be grateful for our good luck. Those who were strong enough crowded into the trucks, and the seriously ill feeble were lifted up with difficulty. My friend and I, we did not hide our rucksacks, now stood in the last group from which 13 would be chosen for the next to last truck. The chief doctor counted on the requisite number, but he omitted the two of us. 13 were loaded onto the truck, and we had to stay behind, surprised, very annoyed and disappointed. We blamed the chief doctor, who excused himself by saying that he had been tired and distracted. He said that he thought we still intended to escape. Impatiently, we sat down, keeping our rucksacks on our backpack, and waited with the few remaining prisoners for the last truck. We had to wait a long time. Finally, we lay down on the mattress of the deserted, guarded room, exhausted by the excitement of the last of few hours and day, during which we had fluctuated continually between hope and despair. We slept in our clothes and shoes, ready for the journey. The noise of rifles and cannons woke us. The flashes of traces, bullets, and gunshots entered the hut. The chief doctor dashed in and ordered us to take cover of the floor. One prisoner jumped off my stomach from the bed above me and with his shoes on. That awakened me all right. That we grasped what was happening. The battlefront had reached us. The shooting decreased, and morning down outside in the camp gate, a white flag floated in the wind. Many weeks later, we found out that even in those last hours, fate and had toyed with us few remaining prisoners. We found out just how uncertain human decisions are, especially in matters of life and death. I was confronted with photographs which had been taken in a small camp not far from ours. Our friend had thought they were traveling to freedom that night, had been taken in the trucks to this camp, and they were locked in the huts and burned to death. Their partially charred bodies were recognizable on the photographs. I thought again of death in Tirhan. Apart from its role as a defensive mechanism, the prisoners' apathy was also the result of other factors. Hunger and lack of sleep contributed to it, as they do in normal life also, and to the general irritability, which was another characteristic of the prisoner's mental state. The lack of sleep was due partly to the pestering of vermin which infested the terrible overcrowded huts because of the general lack of hygiene and sanitation. The fact that we had neither nicotine nor caffeine also contributed to the state of apathy and irritability. Besides these physical causes, there were mental ones in the form of certain complexes. The majority of prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. We all had once been or had fancied ourselves to be somebody. Now we were treated like complete non-entities. The consciousness of one's inner value is encoded in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it?